This is the study session on ethical and professional standards. This is the reading on guidance for standards 1 through 7. This is standard 6, conflicts of interest. And take note that this standard is written directly after the standard on investment analysis. And remember some key words from that standard. Some of those key words were due diligence, hard work, communication with clients. And so the idea here is that those working in the investments profession are inevitably going to be faced with a conflict of interest. This is just a natural part of the industry. And so this standard was written so that members will know how to behave when faced with those conflicts of interest. There are 3 parts to this standard. The first part is disclosure of conflicts. Members and candidates must make full and fair disclosure of all matters that could reasonably be expected to impair their independence and objectivity or interfere with the respective duties to their clients, prospective clients, and employer. Members and candidates must ensure that such disclosures are prominent, are delivered in plain language, and communicate the relevant information effectively. First question we need to ask is, what are the possible sources of conflicts? And so they generally take 2 forms. The compensation paid by employers and others, and then some kind of ownership in companies that are covered by the member. A couple of quick examples here. Suppose a member owns some stock options, and those stock options expire in the relatively near future. Maybe those stock options are out of the money now. Clearly, conflict of interest would be for the member to write and distribute a research report in favor of that particular company so that the stock price may appreciate in the short term, turning those out of the money options into in the money options. It's also tempting for members to issue favorable reports if they actually own the shares of the company. There are several key areas of note here. So let's start with disclosure of conflicts to employers. Members must give the employer enough details to make an independent assessment of the impact of that conflict, and this should make perfect sense. Typical revelations may involve an issue that could interfere with the analyst's ability to render an unbiased investment advice if the analyst is affiliated with the subject company. Of course, this affiliation could take many parts. It could be directly by the member or indirectly by the member's spouse or children or parents. Disclosure to clients. Client has the right to be apprised of anything that could reasonably be expected to impair an objective advice. Remember that previous conflict, due diligence, so we're going to do all that hard work, and we need to make certain that we're not impairing our objective recommendations. Some obvious conflicts of interest which should be disclosed include relationships between an issuer and the member. And this involves things like perhaps the spouse is a director or works for a company that the member is following. There are always relationships between banks and the firms. Of course, commercial banking, investment banking, underwriting, insurance, all that kind of stuff. And so those conflicts of interest should be disclosed. There's always a conflict when there's material beneficial ownership of stock, kickbacks, options. How about cross-departmental conflicts? Think of a scenario under which a member is working in the investments division and is helping a company issue a bond. And this is going to be a big bond issue. And this member wanders over to the research division and says something to the research analyst that sounds like, oh, wouldn't it be awesome if you issued a report on this particular company talking about the massive cash flows they're generating, Executives are on top of the leverage situation, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a cross-departmental conflict. So the firm should establish strict communication protocols to avoid this type of a conflict. How about conflicts with stock ownership? I mean, this is an obvious notion. And those of you who watch some of the business news channels on television will note regularly that when an analyst is being interviewed and there is a conflict, they will often note that there's a conflict. They'll say something like, "Oh, by the way, I own 10,000 shares in this company." Of course, immediate family members are also subject to the same rules. And then sometimes the firm will have restrictive trading policies, and members and candidates must honor those. How about lastly, conflicts as a director? Of course, there's nothing preventing a member from serving on the board of directors of large or small companies. And in that role, the director is probably going to be privileged to hear private information. And the temptation is to use that private information to benefit him or herself. Of course, there's a conflict of interest that violates a couple of different standards right in there. And so disclosure of those director positions is required. Here's an example. Dwayne Richards owns 10,000 shares of Airborne, market value of 89 cents per share. Richards secures a job at a consultancy firm. He learns the stock is part of a restricted list. And so to avoid the conflict of interest, he sells 9,000 shares, transfers 1,000 shares to an account registered under his 18-year-old daughter's name. You know, what's Richards obligated to do here? Now note, the question stem suggests an 89 cent per share, which is not, it's not $89 per share. So it's generally a small amount. And so the question is kind of asking you, boy, does it really matter if this is a small amount of an investment and it's registered under the daughter's name? So clearly the selling of the 9,000 shares, that's good. But keeping the 1,000 shares in the daughter's name is not. So Richards must disclose this information to his employer and mention the same in any report going forward. And so the idea that this is a small and insignificant investment does not change the appearance of a conflict. The second part of this standard, priority of transactions. Investment transactions for clients and employers must have priority over investment transactions in which a member or candidate is the beneficial owner. A couple of things to note here. Of course, investment professionals can be highly compensated, but transactions and the priority of transactions must not disadvantage any clients. In addition, the members must not benefit from transactions undertaken for clients. And of course, members have to abide by all the rules. Classic example is a hot IPO, and the member must not allocate shares for themselves or their family members. How about some recommended procedures for compliance? Limiting the employee participation in IPO, restricting private placements. I always go back to a really cool example that occurred maybe, boy, it's probably been 15 years by now. David Bowie, those of you who know the rock and roll superstar, he issued a bond to build a recording studio, and the investment banker kept it all for themselves, private placements. And so the firm acted as a dealer, and I believe they still have all of those bonds, and they're not publicly traded. And so, although that's not a great example of a private placement to other investors, it still makes the point about being careful about restricting private placements. And then an imposition of a blackout or a restricted period. This makes perfect sense. There should be a reporting procedure established This makes perfect sense to include disclosures of all personal holdings, confirmations of trades, and then detailing that disclosure. The third part of the standard is referral fees. Members and candidates must disclose to their employer, clients, and prospective clients, as appropriate, any compensation, consideration, or benefit received from or paid to others for the recommendation of products or services. Now, why is such a disclosure important? It allows clients or employers to evaluate any partiality shown, and it discloses the full cost of services. And so when a member receives a referral fee, appropriate disclosure implies communication before there is any signing of a contract. It should be done in writing. And those referral fees should include the type of a fee as well as the value. Members and candidates must also disclose when they pay a fee. And that takes us through Standard 6, conflicts of interest. Standard 7 is next.